Good afternoon, good evening, Niner faithful. Welcome to another fantastic Monday episode with your host, Rob Schuh. I am very thrilled to be joined by Jordan Elliot today. We have had him on the channel before, but you went through an entire Twitter renaming that occurred today, Jordan. How you feeling coming out on the other side of it? Splash cousin, no more. J. Lee Elliott in the house.
It was time. I was being pushed by some people who've given me some good guidance, who are, in the journalistic field I am, currently pursuing. That it'd be probably better to have a name that has my actual name involved. So obviously J is for Jordan, Lee is my middle name, obviously Elliot is my last name. The unfortunate part was I learned the hard way that every single variation of the name Jordan Elliott on Twitter has been taken, and half the accounts that have it are like dormant accounts without a profile picture that haven't been used in 10 years. So it's my fault for not getting on Twitter until, 12 years after it started. But I also am sitting there and I'm like, man, it would have been really nice if it could have been something simple. Could have just been my name. But yeah, this is the new me. I'm trying to be a little bit more professional and, with the whole brand recognition thing, have it attached to my name. And it pains me because the Splash Cousin name was very near and dear to me. And that's how I met so many people. But, it's retired. Nobody else will be using it. I'll put it to you like that. It's definitely not one that somebody else will be using. It's retired and off to the side, and maybe one day I'll put it up in the rafters if I ever get the chance to get there.
I like to hear that. That's how I've come to know you, and so there is some emotional attachment there. I can relate to going back and trying to find your name. My experience was that early on when I was streaming alongside Grant on his channel for Sports Illustrated, he put out a tweet where he tagged Rob Schuh. And it turned out to be some dude living over in Germany that started his account, 10 days after Twitter became, hadn't posted anything since. And I just chimed in and I was like, hey, I'm sure that Rob Schuh guy would be great on your show, but I think I might be a little more qualified than him. So yes, I can relate to not having your true name locked down because some joker opened up that account and then has since failed to use it. But it is nice. It is nice to have that transition. Hey, I have always known you to be one of the most professional guys out in the field. I mean, we had that opportunity going out to the NFL Combine, covering it this year. And I was just so impressed with your ability to walk up to and initiate conversations with anyone, didn't matter, and immediately transition that to something relevant with regard to the 49ers. Your ability to pick up on something that was relevant to that individual, relevant to that team, but then quickly pivot to 49er information is second to none, in my opinion, Jordan.
Hey, well, thank you so much. I definitely don't have the journalism background I wish I had, but I definitely have people's skills background. I used to work in sales, as you did too, Rob, and you know that a lot of times, all it takes is having a little bit of willingness to just go up and approach people, and you'd be shocked at what you get back in response. So, it was fantastic. I had a great time hanging out with Rob and Indy. It was an absolute pleasure, not just going to work, but getting to hang out, go get food after, talk, hang out. We were pretty much attached to the hip for 7 days there, and it was an absolute joy. I was bummed when it came to an end, but it was a memory I'll cherish forever for sure.
Me too. It had a bit of that like summer camp vibe to it, right? I mean, it was very much really like we were all kids in a candy store doing what we absolutely love to do, surrounded by these amazing NFL personalities who were all very approachable, it turns out, and very understanding of, hey, you're early in the media game. Like we all came up this same way. So they felt very much a part of a fellowship. And I too was saddened when that all came to a close and it was back to reality, back to the regular grind. I look forward to the draft. I hope that we will have an opportunity to hang out there as well, my friend.
Oh, we absolutely will. And, I brought some fits for Indy, but the vibe will be completely different in Vegas. I will be... You're going to see the fit and you're going to be like, damn, is this guy throwing dice at the craps table or is he reporting on the draft? I'm going to be out there. I'm bringing my best fit for the draft. So just throwing that out there. When you hang out with Rob Schuh and Jason Aponte, you better come prepared because you'll get outdressed real quick if you don't bring your A game.
You gotta bring it. All right, let's go ahead and bring it in this program here. I'm going to bring in the super chat before we get to our first topic here. Richard McDonald. Jordan, you did not have to apologize today for reporting what you heard. We appreciate the hard work you put into your craft. I can say that I'm not even familiar with what Richard's referring to, and that I appreciate the hard work that you put into your craft. I know no one out there that is striving for a higher level of professionalism than you are. Good sir.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate that, Rich. To be honest, so to clarify what it was about was I pretty much in there's Twitter spaces every day. When I have time, when I'm writing or driving, I'm happy to hop in. And if any of you guys are on Twitter or, newer to it, the spaces are a great spot to come in and just listen to stuff where it's more of an extended conversation. It's not as structured as this, but if you're just trying to kill some time, it's a great place. If you want to hear 49ers talk, and pretty much what I was saying was that I assumed they would get something for him. That was my opinion. That wasn't me trying to relay any information that I had heard or anything. That was just strictly my opinion. I'm like, hey, he's a starting NFL quarterback. I don't think he's that good, but I think he's better than a lot of alternatives, and you'll get something for him. Like, I didn't say they would get, a first-round pick or any massive bounty for him, but I'm like, man, there's going to be somebody willing to give up something. And I was just happy to own, I'm happy to be culpable if I get things wrong. And as of now, they haven't gotten anything for him, and he hasn't moved, and a bunch of other quarterbacks have. So I'm happy to sit here and be like, hey, maybe I misjudged what the market was for him. Maybe I got it wrong. In terms of the reporting stuff, I actually don't apologize for any of that, because what I had heard all along from Nate, who Rob knew as well, was that the Colts were a little uneasy because they wanted to have a quarterback who could participate in off-season programs, OTAs, and all that stuff. I'd said it in some Twitter spaces. I mentioned it to a few people I talked to, and that ended up being the reason, according to, I think Diana Rossini or somebody else reported that as well. So there was pretty consistent. And, most of the stuff we were getting from Nate, who Rob knows very well too, we all got to hang out together, was very consistent. He was really spot on. And they made it very clear with the shoulder surgery that Jimmy was always going to be kind of on the back burner. And if they could get a Derek Carr or a Matt Ryan or one of these guys, that would be their preferred avenue. And it doesn't surprise me in the slightest they ended up with Matt Ryan. So I appreciate it, Rich. Thank you so much for the support. But at the same time too, I'm man enough to admit if my opinion doesn't align with what ends up happening, nobody's ever going to bat 1,000 doing this. And at the end of the day, I like to think I'm a pretty humble person, and I can take my lumps when they come. So, I appreciate the support, dude. But believe me, I have no issue saying I got Jimmy's value wrong.
And I think that's something that comes with the gift of prognostication. When you are afforded the opportunity to take some stabs at what might happen, you have to be willing to admit when you were wrong about some of those. And I'm with you. I am all about admitting that. That Niner guy sums up where we are at today from a news cycle very nicely. So I wanted to bring this in. The news is there is no news, just anger. That's how 49ers Twitter feels. The reality is that there was some news that came in today. And it was with regard to the 49ers and this quarterback carousel. It seems to me that the music is slowing down, that this game of musical chairs is coming to a close, and the number of options available for Jimmy Garoppolo and the San Francisco 49ers is down to slim and none. And slim seems to be headed out the back door. How do you see this breaking down for the San Francisco 49ers? Do you see a potential scenario where Jimmy is playing for San Francisco yet again in 2022?
I hope for everybody's sake, the fans, the players, the media, everybody, I hope not, man, because
Right.
It was bad this year when it was pretty clear that the plan was to have Trey sit, and that was something they were comfortable with. But after the way everything unfolded, it would just be a monumental failure on all fronts if Jimmy is brought back. And again, that's not an indictment on him. I don't think it's anything against him as a person or a player. It's just when you have this scenario and you have this plan unfold the way you laid it out, where you're going to have Trey Lance redshirt and you're going to maximize his rookie contract, and you have all these factors that are piling up, basically pointing towards giving Trey Lance the keys being the best possible outcome, and you basically bring Jimmy back because you couldn't get something. Like, you came out pretty publicly, and Jimmy didn't really, mince words when he's like, oh, they're going to help me, find somebody to trade for me, pretty much, at his farewell press conference. So it's not like I don't see a viable path where you can come back to, oh, we were always comfortable keeping him around. It just looks really bad.
Right.
I will say this, though, from the 49ers standpoint, I'm not judging them as much on what has happened to this point as much as I will judge them going forward, based simply on the fact that I don't think anybody thought that the amount of quarterbacks that got moved would get moved. And I think that includes people within the league and other GMs, front office. I don't think anybody thought Matt Ryan was going to move based on that contract. I don't think anybody thought that Deshaun Watson and Baker Mayfield were going to both be on the move in the same offseason. I think a lot of people were under the assumption that even though there was smoke around Russell Wilson for a couple of years now, he probably was going to stay put. So I can understand how the market might have been misjudged based on the fact that not necessarily the 49ers misvalued the player, but maybe they misvalued the supply and demand aspect of this.
Right.
So having said that, I understand that to now, but if you don't pivot now and then cut your losses and move forward, that to me is where the criticism is fair and just. Because again, I think a lot of stuff is played out where it's really hard. You like to think these guys have every scenario mapped out. This is the craziest offseason I can remember ever in the NFL in terms of player movement, and especially at the quarterback position. So I fully understand this being kind of like we didn't expect there to be 7 different openings at quarter, and
right.
These different guys moving around. We expected it to be this place, and this place, and Jimmy looked appealing. Having said that, now you're at a point where you understand that this happened. You have to react and do so accordingly. And if they just keep Jimmy on the roster for the sake of not eating the hey, we missed, we didn't get anything for him. It's, it to me would just reek of stubbornness. And somebody who's fallen victim to their own pride more times than I'd like to admit.
Yes.
Don't do it, 49ers. I can tell you from firsthand experience, it is not worth it. You will not save face. Cut your losses, wish him well, and spin it as, hey, we're letting him go. We're setting him free. We're letting him go pick where he wants to go. Thank you for your time, Jimmy. You make a nice little tribute video. You get a nice PR statement. Everybody wins. But if they hang on to him through camp and they hope for some sort of scenario where they can ship him off late during training camp or something like that, to me, the pros of getting a day 3 draft pick far outweigh the cons of all the circus and commotion that will come from that.
The drama that comes from it. Swan Song, it very much succinctly putting together what you said there as well. No one could have predicted this right. No one could have predicted this correctly. There were just so many variables along the way. I agree. I was one who thought, yeah, I know Russell Wilson wants out of Seattle, but I'm not believing that until I see it. Lo and behold, we see that. I thought Tom Brady might come out of retirement. I didn't think he was going to do it after just 8 weeks. Having said he was going to retire, that certainly threw things off. I agree, though, from the aspect of how ugly it could get from an emotional side of things. I don't think people are taking that human aspect into account when they say, well, you just keep him and you have that quarterback competition. I don't think that takes into account that moment where Jimmy Garoppolo had an emotional farewell to everyone from that media room, right? He was saying goodbye. I never expect to see you all again while standing here wearing a 49ers uniform. This is it. To then go from that to like, oh, here I am again, and it's a quarterback competition. That is just ugly, and it's stressful for Jimmy. It's stressful for everyone in the locker room. It's extremely stressful for the young personality in Trey as he's attempting to exert himself as a leader, and it again divides those practice reps in between two guys that, if either one of them is going to be the starter, could both very much use those reps.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it just comes back to like what I've said all along is that I thought it was acceptable and their plan was appropriate to stick with what they wanted to do, let Jimmy finish out the season, and then you have a clean transition to Trey Lance. And that was the key word of that is clean transition to him being the quarterback one, him being the guy you build the offense around, him being the guy coming into OTAs. And the last thing you need is to have this like dark cloud hanging over the locker room and hanging over the organization. And at the end of the day, for a while, I was like, man, I felt bad that, George Kittle has to answer 17 quarterback questions every time he gets on in front of a microphone. And now it's getting to the point where like, at first I'm like, okay, like, cause people are like, oh, it's the team's fault for doing this. And sure, while they're the ones who did, initiate the move to bring in Trey Lance, they also made it pretty clear, like they were comfortable redshirting him. But if you bring this on again, then you're almost creating a I don't say a hostile work environment because I don't think that's the right word, but you're creating an uncomfortable situation for the players that you like. They're just like any other employees in any other business. If you have people under your supervision that are working for you, if they are more comfortable in the setting that you have them working, the results are probably going to be better. Yes. I'm not saying it's going to cost the 49ers a bunch of games if Jimmy's back on the team, but it creates an unnecessary amount of uncomfort within that whole, again, and it's not just them. Fans are going to be outraged. Media is going to be, it's going to be a problem for everybody. And it's like such a simple solution at this point where it's like, dude, just cut your losses, call it a day. Like you didn't get what you thought you could. I was wrong. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, I knew all along they'd get nothing from him. Like, no, dude, I thought they'd get something for him. They didn't. You move on, let him pick his place. And again, you can spin that as some positive PR thing where you're the good guys and you're letting him go pick and choose wherever. There's something to be had there. Like there is still value, even if it's not equated to a draft pick. What I don't see value in is dragging this out longer than it needs to be.
And I think you have to acknowledge that the fan base would have such a collective sigh of relief of this situation resolving itself, that even if there were no compensation involved, even if they weren't able to successfully spin it, I think fans would view it as a net positive for the most part from the majority. That's the sense that I get at this point. Bringing in MILF Hunter's comment here. Elliot, is that an Under Armour golf shirt? Rich, man, people want to know where is the fit coming from at this point, George. Just wait until you see him in Vegas. The Under Armour shirt is nothing compared to the fits you're going to see. Tim coming in. All these other GMs were able to move their quarterbacks regardless of salary. Do you view this as, depending on the severity of it on your end, do you view this as a strike against John Lynch in his inability, regardless of how situation played out, regardless of the unknown factors that came into play? Is this a strike against John Lynch for failing to move Jimmy?
I can't say that right now because I don't know all the facts. If something comes out where we have a concrete statement that they had an offer they passed up on, then I think it's something to revisit. As of right now, I'm not going to make false, or not false, but I'm not going to make strong judgments against somebody without all the facts laid out and without there being something concrete to fall back on. And I'm not going to have my own speculation push me to that spot. So I wish I could give you a better answer, Tim. I'm sorry. I just think as of now, it doesn't look good, obviously, because we have heard reports they had offers for this and that. But we also saw something today where Mike Florio said that they have an offer of 2 second-round picks in hand. And at this point, it's pretty much like the musical chairs game is up, and the 49ers wouldn't be foolish enough to pass. So it's kind of like some of the stuff that you hear or see, there's plenty of stuff that gets said that isn't exactly factual. So again, it's really hard without knowing what is really true to make a strong statement either way. I do think, again, I'm not as inclined to make a judgment against the front office based on what's happened to now. It's how the next couple weeks to couple months plays out. If he's still on this roster when OTAs come around and training camp rolls around, then I think you messed it up. As of now, there's just, there's too many variables at play that I don't think anybody could have expected. And I think it's one thing to have, an expected thing where, hey, you should have a plan B and C for this. I don't think anybody had a plan for the way this offseason went. I think the majority of NFL front offices were taken by surprise as to how this all played out. So I can't sit here and, say that about all 31 other teams and be like, okay, well, John Lynch is terrible. He's the one who messed this all up. It's not fair to him and it's not fair to the front office. But if he continues to, not do anything with Jimmy and he just kind of sits there and they kind of ignore it and the draft rolls around and they start talking about these draft picks and training camp and Jimmy's just kind of there, that's when I start to question it, because I don't think there's any possibility now that I'm saying that there's no way that happens because they're going to get asked about it every day. So it just doesn't make sense to me. It's getting to the point where I happily disagree with people. I am never going to be the arbiter of what's right and what's wrong, but I like to think we all have a grasp on, common sense, or at least can understand what is common sense. And common sense should tell you that it's time to cut bait and just, go your separate ways. And it's infuriating that this is still at the point where it might drag on more and more and more. And just the thought of it is just grinding my gears, because I'm like, dude, we're going to have to do this every day for 3-4 more months. Yes.
Infuriating is a good word to choose there. I think that is the sensation I'm feeling here as well. I disagree with you slightly. Where I agree is that it's much more prudent to judge this front office based on what happens from this point forward. I do believe that there were a lot of unknowns that came into play in this process, and it was impossible to predict them all. I would disagree slightly in saying that I don't think it's a stretch to assume, based on the facts that we're aware of to this point, and while some of them are more rumor than fact, I think it is fair to say it was misplayed to some degree. The severity to which I'm just getting tongue-tied at this point, to which with it has been impacted. That could be argued, but I think to say that it hasn't been handled poorly because Jimmy's still on the roster, right? The idea that at some point in time they probably could have moved him, they could have gotten something in return. They failed to do so because they thought they could get more. And at that time, I don't know that I would have done any different. I'm not saying I could have done better, but I think at this point it's fair to say that they misplayed it to some extent.
Yeah, and that definitely probably has, a good amount, even though we can't like verify everything. Like, I also like to think we can, deduce things from the outside looking in a lot of times. Like, there's ways you can kind of eliminate scenarios, and that seems to be something that's probably on the table. And I keep thinking back to when John Lynch was first asked about Jimmy getting that surgery, and I personally was like, oh, they'll figure it out. There's no way that somebody would push him to get that surgery if it was going to affect his trade market. They have to have some kind of idea. Same thing with when they weren't moving him right away. I'm like, hey, they have to have some kind of idea that some team will want him for something and they can fall back onto something. I don't think there's any chance they're just sitting here and hanging on to him on the hopes that maybe that, like, just, kind of like sitting by the phone, hoping it rings. Like, they're all just in a room sitting there with the phone at the center of the table, hoping it lights up and rings. Like, I also am at the point now where like all these other quarterbacks are getting moved and the spots are drying up, and maybe I was wrong. Maybe there wasn't a concrete plan. I just can't confidently say that without all the facts. That's just how I operate. I'm not really big into speculating stuff. I'm happy to opine and give my opinion, but I don't want to say like, oh, they completely butchered this. Cause you know what? Tomorrow, like the Texans or Panthers could call and give them a 3rd round pick. And I don't think that would be a terrible thing. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm not saying it's likely to happen, but until it completely plays out, I just don't want to be the person that has to come back and backpedal and be like, well, actually, like, again, I'm happy to admit when I was wrong. I don't like backpedaling, and I would much rather just, let it play out than do that.
I think that is a very, very reasonable approach. Jordan, that Niner guy coming in, they already gave him the goodbye presser, but this is a fundamental disaster. They have more holes in the starting lineup, no cap space. To think you will find multiple contributors in the draft at 61. I think that, to me, I'm not terribly worried right now with Jimmy's salary on there and it hindering the San Francisco 49ers. But as we move forward, as we have to sign our draft picks, as we do fill out the rest of this roster, as we begin the contract extensions for Bosa, Debo, at least those talks heat up, I do think that it starts to hamstring us. Do you see this, Jordan, as a limiting factor for the 49ers in having Jimmy Garoppolo's salary on the books right now?
I think it's an obstacle. I don't think that it's something that has, like, this is how I look at it. It's like, if you have to go somewhere, it's much easier to get there going up the freeway and getting off rather than having to get off 3 exits before and take a back road detour. That's kind of where I'm looking at it. Like, you're still going to get to the end destination. It's just going to take you longer and be much more inconvenient. And I think it's kind of the same situation. Like, they can still go out and sign guys if they want, but they're going to have to move money around. They're going to have to get creative with other deals. So I don't think it's outright prevented them from doing anything, but I also think there's no way you can spin this as it hasn't made things more difficult, because it absolutely has made it. If you have the money in hand and ready to spend, it's objectively more easier to get these deals done. So it's not even really from a point of like opinion at this point. It's literally a fact. If that money was there and available, it's literally easier. Like, that's something that shouldn't even be argued. I do think the debate where opinion does come in a little bit more is how much it's limited them. And right. I do think there are creative enough ways. If they really, like, I don't think Jimmy Garoppolo is the reason they don't have like Chandler Jones or Von Miller or some of these guys. I think if those guys really wanted the 49ers that badly, they could make it happen. I would say, though, that if there was some need to restructure or there was some verbiage in the contract, and I will never pretend to be an expert on that stuff. There are people who I rely on for that, who are much smarter than myself, who literally solely focus on salary cap and numbers and stuff. But on my own basic understanding, I would imagine that it is a little bit more difficult if you're going into these negotiations and you're having to rework things and this and that, when another team's just like, hey, we're going to give you X amount of years, X amount of guaranteed dollars, no strings attached. Here you go. Boom. Like, I don't think that a lot of these top flight guys are really just like pining so hard to play for the 49ers that they're willing to just kind of like wait this all out. But I do think a lot of the kind of middle tier and maybe lesser known free agents would be. And I think that's where it, like, that lines up more so, in my opinion, with what the 49ers like to do anyway. They're not really going to make huge splashes every year in free agency. And, when people say that they never do, like, yeah, they have before. They brought in Richard Sherman. They brought in Quan Alexander. They've done it in the past. They traded for D Ford and extended him. It wasn't a free agent thing, but it pretty much, was a free agent deal that cost him a second-round pick when you look at the contract and how it all played out. Swing. Yeah, so I just think that they're at the point now where it doesn't make as much sense to take those big swings on those guys like that. But if you wanted to, like don't get me wrong, I would have thought that Von Miller across from Nick Bosa would have been phenomenal. Yes. And it would have been much, much easier to do if you had the money in hand. I'm just saying that I don't think that Jimmy Garoppolo is the reason that these guys didn't end up as 49ers and in 49ers uniforms. Like, there's much more at play here. It just complicated things. It didn't prevent things, but it 100% complicated things more so than
that's what I'm fully on board with, is the idea that it did not prevent any of these signings, that if they truly wanted to get it done, they had other options, but it most certainly complicated it. I don't think that can be argued. I think people have to acknowledge that there are additional steps required because of the need to move around money in order to free it up. Whereas, as you said, if you just had that money available, you'd be able to sign those free agents. Quesadilla Thrilla 71 coming in just to be kind, lay down that super sticker. Before we transition into these topics, because I do want to keep talking about the quarterback, Ellis 10 says, worst case scenario, Jimmy G is cut and Lance it is. That doesn't sound like too bad of a scenario to me. And no real question involved there. Just stating the obvious that, hey, maybe we don't need to panic. Maybe a worst case scenario is we don't get some of that draft compensation coming back, but it ain't the end of the world. Here we do have a question. This takes us back into the quarterback here. Mike Fuss coming in. Can the Niners trade Jimmy G for Sam Darnold and a pick and then cut Darnold, assuming his dead money is less than Jimmy? I want to bring in this conversation around the teams remaining. And in order to do so, I'm going to inject Matt Mayoko's tweet from today. He lists out NFL teams with starting quarterback issues. The Texans with Davis Mills. The Seahawks with Drew Lock, Geno Smith, and Jacob Eason. The Panthers with Sam Darnold and PJ Walker. The ones that got filled today, the Colts currently have Matt Ryan. The Saints have Jameis Winston. And the Falcons with Marcus Mariota. So where do you see, do you agree with Matt Mayoko that those are the three teams that Niner fans who are obsessed with quarterback situations should be most aware of? And between those three, what do you think is the most likely trade partner for San Francisco?
I mean, I don't think the Seattle one's out of the question, first of all. I think a lot of times people write that off. I mean, Washington got Donovan McNabb from Philly. Mm-hmm. There's not much precedent for it, but it's happened in the past.
It has happened.
I think that, like, if I'm Seattle, I'm like, I've seen this guy up close for a couple of years. I don't know how eager I'd be to, give up a lot of draft capital for him. And I think that Seattle's just not a great team as is. I'm not a big believer in Drew Lock, to be honest. I don't trust any quarterback that wears a shooting sleeve on their arm. Those are you're not Allen Iverson. I think that was a major red flag when I first saw that, and I'm like, oh, okay, and I saw Drew Lock singing Jeezy on the sideline. I'm like, hey, maybe this will be fun, man. And after watching him in Denver for a couple years, no, I'm sorry, I don't believe in him. Texans, people will always say because of the Caserio, the New England connection, and all that. I don't think Davis Mills was that bad. I thought Davis Mills for a third-round pick was a pretty decent player, and I could see a scenario where, Kirk Cousins made a pretty lengthy NFL career out of being a mid-round guy. I think he was a fourth-round pick, if I remember correctly, who took a little time to develop, but has turned into, just a serviceable starter. And I think Davis Mills has arguably better physical traits than Kirk Cousins does. So I'm not saying that he's going to have the same career arc, but if you're the Texans, you got to be feeling pretty good that, hey, we might have something with this guy that we can build around, and we have a cheap contract for a couple more years. Like, I don't see Jimmy G as this massive upgrade. Carolina's where it gets interesting, and here's why.
Yes.
Sam Darnold is not good. And I was one of those people that was like, well, maybe it was the Jets. Maybe it was Adam Gase. I remember his Rose Bowl performance a few years ago when he was still at USC. And I'm like, man, this guy's got his arm. He's got some talent. Like, it's there. Maybe he just needs to get in the right situation. I thought that he was in as ideal of a situation as he possibly could have been in. And he looked okay when McCaffrey was still healthy and he was able to get the ball out to guys like DJ Moore. But after watching it for a full season, I think it's just we're at the point now where we can't just keep blaming the surrounding situation. Like, maybe Sam Darnold just isn't very good as an NFL quarterback. And hard to do. That's, not, he's not the first and he won't be the last. But if you're Carolina, they have an owner who made it no secret he really wanted to get Deshaun Watson, who wanted to really make this big splash, who's a very wealthy individual, who is one of those people that's willing to write checks to get things done.
Right.
And I think it's very clear that the patience with their head coach and Matt Rule is growing very thin. And I think he's definitely somebody, like if we're talking about coaches on the hot seat,
yeah,
he's the first name that comes to mind to me.
No doubt.
They need to win games this year is the point I'm trying to make. And I think that Jimmy Garoppolo, for all of his faults, gives you a much better chance to win football games than Sam Darnold does. And if you're the Panthers, again, maybe ownership wouldn't sign off on that. But if the front office and the head coach have any say here, you're swinging for the fences to keep your job here. And at this point, I would much rather put my eggs in the Jimmy Garoppolo basket than the Sam Darnold basket. From the outside looking in, that's not a situation I would ever want to end up in. But you know what? That's the reality of their future at this point. And that's to me where it's like, hey, if you could ship off a 4th round pick and have Jimmy and Darnold and bring him in for some kind of competition, that to me is better than the alternative of just rolling with Sam Darnold this year and trying to expect that you're just going to somehow magically reverse the first few years of his NFL career, which it pretty much showed us.
Yeah.
He's not a great quarterback. So not even he's not a good quarterback. And I hate saying stuff like that. I don't ever sound disrespectful, but film doesn't lie, man. We have years.
Yeah. And it's all relatively speaking, right? I mean, we're talking about him relative to other starting caliber quarterbacks. That still makes you one of the world's best athletes when it comes to being a quarterback in the world. It just means in the NFL, where there are other world-class athletes, you are not at the top of your game there. But as far as the rest of the population, go to any high school, he was probably the best player there, right? It is that relative to. It is all relative in this. Now, if so, it sounds like what you're saying there is that the Carolina Panthers seem like the most logical spot of the 3 to you regardless. What do you think of this idea that's presented here? And I've seen it in 49ers Twitter as well, of getting somewhat creative in attempting to package picks with Jimmy Garoppolo, bringing back Darnold to take that contract off of their hands, thus netting the 49ers a better overall pick. Do you see this as a potential scenario the Niners might explore in order to save some face so that it looks like something bigger is coming back than what actually is?
I mean, if you can, send a 4th and get back a 2nd or something, I wouldn't be opposed to it. But I don't see where Carolina's motivation to really do that. I don't think Carolina has picks actually like that, at least in this draft.
They don't have a second rounder,
yeah.
That's for sure.
So, I mean, there's not that option to me. Like, it sounds great in theory, but in practicality, I just don't think that it's something that they can realistically pull off with a team like Carolina, to be honest.
I'm telling you, this game of musical chairs is not a fun one for 49er faithful. Charles Thurman coming in, cut Jimmy and let Trey play. It may come down to that. I'm holding out just because I've already said Jimmy's going to get traded and traded for value. I'm already going to have to walk that one back, so I'm sticking with it until that is what doesn't happen, and then I'll admit that I was wrong. I got no problem admitting I was wrong. Sean 9519ers coming in. 49ers have the Mr. Irrelevant draft pick in 2022. Trade Jimmy and that draft pick for anything so the front office can give solace to the faithful. LOL. I mean, I am fine with packaging picks with Jimmy in order to get something back. At this point in time, I am honestly struggling to see where that deal gets done. I do want to bring in Jamal Armstrong with the clutch comment here. Hey, man, Davis Mills wears a sleeve from time to time. He's got a little something to him. Just saying. I appreciate Jamal in here talking about that sleeve, the shooting sleeve for Davis Mills as well. Bringing the conversation back full 360. All right, let's transition topics here and let's get into this next one. I wanted to ask you, a lot of people present this idea that, it may have been the actions taken by Don Yee, Jimmy's agent, that have gotten the 49ers into where they are right now. But I honestly, looking at this from Jimmy's perspective, I can't imagine this is the way he wanted it to play out. I can't imagine that Jimmy Garoppolo wants to get cut at the end of this scenario. I would think his ideal scenario would have been to be traded to the team he had his eyes on for the least amount of compensation possible so that team isn't handicapped. But do you see this as a situation where Jimmy is happy with the way in which it's playing out to this point?
I mean, he's still here, so no, I don't think he's, sitting here celebrating, having like a victory lap. Like I've seen a lot of people speculate is what's happening. It kind of sucks because I'm not here crying crocodile tears for Jimmy Garoppolo, but if I'm also looking at this, like, the 49ers are a team that you've won a lot of games with. They have a good situation. They have a strong offensive staff. They have good playmakers. They have a good team. It's going to be really hard to go anywhere that's going to, really get close to that level. Now you're at the point where it's like, are you going to end up on a team with a winning record next year, no matter how strong your efforts are as the quarterback to help them out? And so, no, I don't. I think Jimmy Garoppolo, for as much as people bag on the guy, like, he's still a competitor. And I think if he's looking at this, it's like, well, where am I going to go that's going to even give me like a fraction of the, chance to contend that I had in San Francisco? And I just don't see anywhere that's open. Houston, you're not getting that. Carolina, you're not getting that. People talk about money and this and that. Like, hey, money's great, but there's these guys, there's a lot more that makes them tick than a paycheck at the end of the day. And Jimmy Garoppolo's secured generational wealth from the 49ers already. I don't think that money is the end all be all move here. So no, I don't think that he's sitting here happy with how things have played out. But at the same time too, he's responsible for the way a lot of this has played out too. So it's not like he's just some innocent bystander that's a victim of circumstance here. I don't want it to sound like that either.
That's a fair statement. And I think, honestly, nobody's happy with the way this has played out, aside from those that are rooting for the 49ers to fail in this situation. So anyone who had their own quarterback that they wanted to move, anyone within the division, I could see those people being happy with the way this is playing out. But the fan base is certainly not happy. The front office has egg on their face. The head coach can't commit to one wide receiver or the other. The ownership is having to fork out all of this money for a quarterback that, should be moved to another team. Jimmy isn't able to move forward with his new team and sort of just get rid of this entire scenario that I'm sure is weighing on him to some resolve. So, yes, I concur that I don't think this is what Jimmy had in mind when he had his surgery when he did. I think if he was, as Joe Staley suggested, doing that in sort of a business move, my interpretation of it was to hinder his own value, but not completely wash out any trade from happening. That, to me, came as a result of all the unexpected quarterbacks moving. Well, we have a super chat that ties in nicely to my follow-up question, so I'm going to bring that in as well. Joe Mama, do you think the Niners are waiting to cut Jimmy until right before the draft as a screw you to Jimmy for having his surgery late? It's possible. I'll answer that first. I don't think so. I don't think the 49ers are waiting to screw Jimmy. I don't think they have any interest in attempting to give one final FU to Jimmy. I'm guessing that there's pretty good feelings and conversation going on in between those two parties. I did get a sense from John Lynch that he was caught off guard by that surgery news. That was the one piece that makes me think there's a little something that it ain't right in paradise there between the two parties, but that's understandable when you're attempting to sign him. The question I have that I want to get to is health the issue? Will the 49ers attempt to hold on to Jimmy Garoppolo until they can release him without triggering that $7.5 million injury guarantee? So is that, Jordan, is that what you see as a potential next date that triggers some movement by the San Francisco 49ers? Or do you think they wouldn't care about that $7.5 million and they will decide to cut him at some point and then just go ahead and move forward with that?
I mean, I think it definitely matters. I mean, no matter how much money you have, $7.5 million is a lot of money.
Right.
I don't think they're in a spot either where they're like sitting here waiting to spite Jimmy Garoppolo or, have some petty vendetta against him. I just think, again, this comes down to something as simple as they probably misread how this quarterback carousel is going to play out. And I don't think, again, any of us really had a roadmap for how this was going to go. This has never happened in an NFL offseason before. So, like, the next date to me, that it's more so not like a date that's set on the calendar as much as it's, if Carolina comes out with a strong statement and they make it clear they're not interested, maybe Seattle trades for Baker Mayfield. It just comes down to like who's really left. Because again, I think you could argue there's places where Jimmy Garoppolo would be better than the incumbent they already have.
Right.
But how much is it worth them giving up the draft capital rather than just waiting out and, the 49ers eventually cut? you can sell him on coming in and competing for the job and whatnot. I there's not a date in mind. I think it's just them kind of watching how the market plays out.
And if that happens, if those two teams settle on a quarterback elsewhere or, align themselves with somebody that's already on the team and commit going forward, would you see that as a potential moment in time where the 49ers might decide to cut Jimmy Garoppolo? Or do you think they would hang on to him just in the case that there are some injuries in camp for another team? My mindset is that the 49ers could potentially hold on to Jimmy Garoppolo up until the point that it requires him to come in and do any type of physical activity for the team. Do you believe that he could be cut prior to that?
Yeah, I think he could, and I think he should, because, you could sit around and wait, and maybe some team does get desperate and give you that second-round pick in August because their alternative is having a bad season. Like that Sam Bradford trade to Minnesota is always the one we fall back on. Teddy Bridgewater, unfortunately, suffers that horrific injury during camp. And then you end up in a situation where they wanted to compete. They wanted to be a team that was making noise that year. So they send a first-round pick over to the Eagles, who had just drafted Carson Wentz. Not the same situation. He's a rookie, but, you have a young quarterback that hasn't really proven themselves yet. And they were willing to move off of the veteran they had because they got a first-round pick in return. If I'm the 49ers, I just don't think the positives of getting a high draft pick, maybe uncertainty, is not worth the certainty of the commotion and uncomfortableness that keeping him around is going to cause. And again, it's like, I hate saying stuff like that because it makes it seem like Jimmy Garoppolo is this like cancerous person that's just like ruining the 49ers. And it's not the case at all. It's just the situation that's been created. Like the 49ers need to be the adult in the room. Like at the end of the day, you hold the parents accountable for how the situation plays out with the children, right? And let's say Jimmy Garoppolo and Trey Lance are the ones, like they created the situation, right? Like they're the ones who are kind of, it's not apples to apples, but they're the ones kind of overseeing the situation. They need to be the adults in the room and be the one to end it because Jimmy Garoppolo and Trey Lance can't do that. So they need to just come out and cut him. And if there's nothing there, again, you spin this as, hey, we didn't have the markets didn't develop the way we thought it could. Some stuff presented itself. We were offered some deals, but we felt this was in the best interest of Jimmy Garoppolo, and we want to thank him for his time here and give him the best. There's a million ways you can spin this. And sure, the people who've been on this every day, the dedicated people who are in the comments here, who are really good at keeping up to date with 49er stuff and know their stuff, they might see right through that. But the 49ers fan base is massive, and there's enough people that will be like, oh, wow, what, they'll give a nice little golf clap and applaud their team for being upstanding people. And that's really ultimately who you have to win over here. And I think there's just such a better avenue for them to do that rather than hold on to him and hope that maybe you can get something down the line. Because if he ends up staying on the roster through camp and into the season, oh my God, I don't even want to think about that.
So Jordan, you've just spelled out what I hope the 49ers do while illustrating what you think would be foolish. And what you spell out as being foolish is what I fear the 49ers are actually going to do this offseason. I truly believe that they are going to be stubborn with this one and that Jimmy will stay on the books for a lot longer than I'm currently comfortable with because of the stress it causes on me for no other reason than the stress it causes me to have to talk about it. I'm very selfish in that way. Jimmy J coming in here, one of the sneakerheads on our channel with the super chat. One thing is almost certain. 61 is going to have to be for offensive line. Still no certainty that Mack is coming back or if McGlinchey will be ready to go. I think that the need at offensive line is very real. I'm not entirely convinced that the 49ers will pigeonhole themselves into one position at 61. I could see them going in a number of directions, whether it be interior offensive line seems like a very strong one to me, but I could see them going edge rusher, especially if one of those top candidates falls. And then I could still see them investing in the safety position, even after the move that they more recently did. Do you see the 49ers' biggest area of need as Jimmy J does here at offensive line for that first pick?
I don't. And I know a lot of people feel that way, and I can understand how they do. So I don't want to, say that I think Jimmy J is wrong. I just am looking at it a little differently. I personally think that Daniel Brunskill is an average guard. I think he's somebody that gives you starting level production for the majority of a season. And yeah, he's not going to be a superstar, and he has his moments where he doesn't look great, but he's a lot better than I think he gets credit for. So I think if they're able to bring him back, it solidifies things a bit more. I have belief in Aaron Banks. I think Aaron Banks, once he moves back to the left side, which is what I imagine the 49ers have to be planning for him, especially given that they let Laken Tomlinson walk, the line isn't in as bad a shape as I think it is. And I'm pretty sure Alex Mack will be back. The McGlinchey stuff is fair, though. Nobody really knows what's going to happen with him. But I think that the O-line class is deep enough that you can address some of those needs later in the third round. They have 2 picks in the third, maybe one of those two. I still think that this 49ers team is going to end up taking an edge guy at 61. The amount of edge rushers they met with at the combine really stood out. The meetings they had with them all went really well. And I think that that's just kind of the philosophy of the team. So I don't think Jimmy J is wrong in the slightest, and that, there is no certainty with Mac, and that nobody knows about McGlinchey. That's really still up in the air. I just think based on the way this team operates and based on what I was privy to, seeing who they were meeting with and how those meetings went, that edge is still the most likely outcome, in my opinion, at 61. And the fact that it's a very deep edge class, and I think you could get a guy who could be a contributor on week one. He may not start right away, but somebody who could get, a handful of snaps on week one and be a part of that defensive line rotation, making an impact.
Yeah, you have a dual win where you're filling a need and getting one of the best players available. Whenever you are able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone in that respect, you got to go for it. John Solo, another sneakerhead on the channel here, says, Jimmy helped win a lot of games for us. Unfortunately, kid is built like a wet paper bag. I think we've got to make that cut for locker room harmony. John Solo is hitting on something that I think you drove home very nicely here, Jordan. And to me, it is the human element that must be considered. I do believe that you could potentially hinder the development of the most important piece of the San Francisco 49ers going forward. I would argue that is Trey Lance, from the human aspect, to have said, hey, this is going to be your team going forward, to just kidding, we're going to bring Jimmy Garoppolo back and you're going to have to deal with all that BS for another 4 months. That back and forth to me is unacceptable when you're talking about properly preparing someone to be your franchise quarterback. It seems a lot cleaner to just admit we got the value on Jimmy Garoppolo wrong. We misplayed our hand in whatever way we misplayed it. And now we're doing what's best for the organization. And in doing so, we acknowledge we are giving up, a second or a third round pick as the potential compensation we could drag out of some team if we held on to this for so long. But to get rid of all that speculation, a second or a third round pick, giving up a second or a third round pick seems almost worth it at this point.
Yeah, and it's just like I think John makes a great point. Like, at this point, it's so hard to have these discussions when you talk about things that aren't quantifiable, like chemistry and mood and locker room harmony. But it matters. And while it's difficult for us on the outside looking in to, again, have discussions, there's no box score we can point to. There's no game film we can point to that shows a specific level of reference for, harmony within the locker room. But the 49ers understand that. And I just don't see how they could have watched how the last year played out and don't understand how much of a curveball it throws into their plans have it. It's like that old John Madden saying, right? Like, if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have none. Like, the more and more I hear that, the more I'm like, that really does ring true. Because I used to be like, hey, well, if you have 2 good you could trade one. If one goes down, like, it's better to have options. But I understand more and more why that was said, because it's just too polarizing of a position. And Jimmy Garoppolo is too polarizing of a player to keep around and just have him kind of waiting in the wings. And to me, the message you send to Trey Lance by shipping Jimmy Garoppolo off and cutting him and wishing him well is far more valuable than getting a 5th or 6th round pick at this point. I would add that is like, so that's like down the line at like training camp. If you could still get a 5th or 6th for him in the next 10 days, that's absolutely worth it. But hanging on basically beyond OTAs, whatever you get back in terms of draft compensation is not worth what you would get from putting confidence in your 22-year-old franchise quarterback that you moved mountains to draft last offseason, and arguably the biggest trade in the history of your illustrious franchise. So John's right. John's right. He worded it very well. They won a lot of games. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked out, and they need to cut him. I hate to take the long-winded response to just saying, yes, John was right, but it's
no, but that's the logic that backs up why you support his decision there, his suggestion there. Murphy coming in. Rob, don't you think the Niners know what they have in Lance after seeing him for a year? If so, doesn't that tell you what they think of him by not going all in this offseason? This is something that I have speculated about, which is my interpretation of the 49ers moves to this point in free agency. And we'll transition to that topic as we, round out this conversation is free agency and what the Niners have done so far. But my interpretation of what they've done in free agency has shown a mildly conservative approach. They believe themselves to be a very talented team that did not need to add significant pieces in order to stay in competition. And so you didn't see any moves out of desperation. But I also viewed them to not make those moves that a team who views themselves right on the cusp typically would make. A big trade, a big addition, just one or two key moves are generally made by those teams that view themselves at the top to stay relevant or to push themselves over the top to get to that cusp or beyond that cusp. So I have interpreted this to mean that the 49ers are in a bit of a wait and see mode. I don't think that the jury's completely out. I think they know what they have. And I do think they want to see Trey Lance be successful within the offense before they continue shoving chips into the middle of the table. Do you think I'm crazy in speculating that, Jordan?
No, not crazy, but I do think that there is more to it than that. Like, I think like that term pushed all in, I think gets thrown around a bunch, and it's hard when you play the Rams twice, 3 times this year. But the Rams also, like, they went all in and got Von Miller at the trade deadline. Last offseason, yes, they made the move to get Matthew Stafford. But if we're comparing team to team, like the 49ers moved more capital to bring in Trey Lance, who's younger and arguably has, I don't want to say greater potential because Matthew Stafford just won the Super Bowl, but there's a range of outcomes where if Trey Lance pans out, you have a much larger window given the fact he's 10 years younger than, you know what I mean? So I do think that the 49ers haven't really tipped their intentions either way. I don't think that there was moves really to be made that would indicate they're going all in. And, like, they've made it pretty clear that their plan is to keep this window open as long as possible. And I think that regardless of who the quarterback is, they're going to make moves that allow them to keep flexibility so that they feel going into next offseason and the offseason after that, they're not stuck at a point where they're cutting guys. Because ultimately what ends up happening is, there's these conversations where, yes, the salary cap can be manipulated. You can do stuff to alter the numbers, but eventually you get good teams that have to part with players that they otherwise likely would not want to, and you end up with a team like New Orleans. I'm sure is going to be a great team next year. You can't convince me New Orleans wouldn't be better off having Armstead, the left tackle, who's been fantastic for them.
Right.
It gets to a point where the 49ers have made it very clear they're going to be reluctant to make those kind of moves. So I don't think it was an indictment on Trey Lance as much as it's just not really how they operate. But I can understand how it's not encouraging. Like, I'm sure if they added a bunch of skill position guys and they were doing, a bunch of stuff, people would feel more comfortable, but it just doesn't really line up with how they've operated in the past, in my opinion. So I'm not really looking at it as a Trey Lance thing. I'm just kind of looking at it as this is a 49ers front office thing, and they haven't really, in fact, I'm a little bit more encouraged, to be honest, that they've kind of stuck by their guns rather than altering everything based on the fact that there might be a quarterback change. Like, they seem pretty set in their ways. And while they haven't delivered the elusive 6th Lombardi trophy, I get that's the ultimate goal. They've still been a competitive team when they've been healthy the last couple of years. So it's kind of hard for me to sit here and, say they've gotten it completely wrong. So I don't fault them. Like last year, there was a lot of people complaining that the signings weren't good enough and they didn't make enough moves, and they were 3 points away from getting into the Super Bowl. So it's kind of like, it's difficult for me to sit here and be like, they're not going all in and this is what's preventing them from winning. I think ultimately there's just other factors at play, and a part of it was the quarterback wasn't good enough. I hate to put it that way.
Yeah.
And hopefully Trey Lance is what gets you over that hump, because I think honestly the quarterback play is what's kept them from ultimately winning a Super Bowl 2 out of the last 3 years. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, right? I mean, it's that type of league where if the Saints had come through and held up their end of the bargain, it may not have mattered what the Niners were able to do. They may have missed the playoffs last year, right? I mean, it was such a close-knit season that one game here or there could have meant the 49ers were completely out of the playoffs versus where they ended up in the NFC Championship game, surpassing all of our expectations. I do find myself more in the middle. I definitely don't view the lack of moves as an indictment against Trey Lance, but I do see a conservative approach as a reflection of the 49ers wait and see and say, hey, let's confirm what we have in Trey Lance, much like Buffalo did in waiting until after year 2 before they went out and made that big trade for Diggs to bring him in, right? You really wanted to make sure what you had in the quarterback before you then take all of the available assets and say, this is our window, push them in now, let's be aggressive. To me, they're being prudent, which is the strategy they've been following for years. And I agree, it's a savvy one that has kept them relevant.
Yeah, and again, like it's all like opinion at this point, right? So none of
Yes.
us are really right or wrong, and nobody should feel wrong for feeling a certain way about this. And the biggest thing for me is that I, like Rob was there, I spent hours and hours and hours in Indianapolis asking any scouts, coaches, players, media people, anybody I could, what they had heard about Trey Lance, what their own subjective opinion about Trey Lance was. And these are people that have no ties to the 49ers. I'd say, they talk, like these people within the league talk, but they don't have any affiliation to the point where they would need to lie or create some kind of false narrative to make the 49ers look better. And the majority of the feedback I got was that they think he's going to be pretty good. They think Kyle's the guy to get the most out of him. They think that this combination could end up being pretty good. So to me, when you couple that with the reports we see from, like, I think Matt Mayoko has more than earned the distinction as one of the most, if not the most reliable reporters covering the 49ers. And he said for a long time that the plan is to hand the keys over to Trey Lance this offseason. That's how they're operating. That's how they've been operating. So until it doesn't happen, I have no reason to believe otherwise, but that doesn't mean that it's 100% happening. And it doesn't mean that anybody else should have to have that same level of, I don't want to say blind faith, because it's not, something that I'm sitting here like they have to do this, but I have no problem being like, okay, well, I got it wrong, and they stuck with Jimmy a few months from now. I just don't really see it playing out that way, if that makes sense. Like, I just think that they have to know better, man. Like,
yes. And by the way, when I say that they're being, somewhat conservative in their approach, I don't take that to mean that they aren't going forward with Trey Lance. I think they believe Trey Lance is a starter. They're going forward with him as a starter. I just do think that they're more likely to be aggressive in an in-season trade once they've already won a few games than they are likely to go after one of the big-name free agents right now when things are a little bit unsettled, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think Aaron just nailed it. He's comparing it to like stocks that, like, you're just watching the value dip. Like, what's the I'm sorry, I'm not into crypto, so I apologize for anybody if I'm butchering this, but I always see the like hodl memes, the people that like hold like crypto way too long.
Yes.
That's what it feels like the 49ers are at, where they like, and it sucks to me because it's not like they traded a second round pick for Jimmy, and they got 2 NFC championship games into Super Bowl with him. And most people can kind of come to the consensus that, like, while it was great and they won a lot of games, he kind of was a big part of why they didn't get over the hill ultimately. So, like, to me, you won already. You got the return back on your investment. Like, it's like this weird, desire to come out on top with this and get some kind of value where you could go back and be like, hey, we had him for 5 years and then we got back a second round pick after, like, it doesn't matter. You got a second round pick worth of value out of Jimmy Garoppolo, starting even the limited number of games he did and getting to the 2 NFC championship games. Like, to me, that's a net win. But it feels like what Aaron said is kind of what's happening, where it's like they're just watching it go down and down and down, hoping that it's just going to turn around. And I'm not a stock market guy. I don't day trade. I don't do any of that stuff. Don't let the Under Armour golf shirt fool you. That's not my bag. I imagine that'd be a pretty foolish strategy in that line of work as well, where at a certain point you just kind of have to cut your losses and be like, hey, I'll live to see another day. And it's upsetting if the 49ers get to a point where they are just stubbornly holding or hodling, hoping that it goes back up, because I just don't see that happening. Yes. Barring a catastrophic circumstance where another team is out their starting quarterback a week before the season starts. But even then, like,
getting lucky in that regard.
And to me, that's just like, if some people would say it's smart business, to me, it's bad. Like, I'm not going to operate my business under the hope and a prayer that another player gets injured or gets hurt or gets, decides to retire, something like that's not how I'm operating. I'm operating under, let's make life easy for Trey Lance, Jimmy Garoppolo. It's been a good 5 years and let's move on. But I understand why people are concerned the 49ers might not feel that way, because their actions haven't really given people faith that they are going to make a swift and what we all probably assume is an easy decision to cut the guy.
Right. I don't know that it is. I'm not necessarily on that camp that it's an easy decision to do so, but I am starting to get on board with the idea that it may be the right decision to do it. But Murphy comes back in. If the Niners believed Trey was the guy, they would dump Jimmy and go all in on free agency. They don't, which is why they need those draft picks and why I think they keep Jimmy barring an injury and a desperate team. I do think there is another angle to consider, and I think that it is, number one, believing that you have a valuable asset and that you want something in return for that. So there's that stubborn nature to it. But I also think Dirk Pippen brought up a great point that I'll bring up momentarily before I come back to Murphy's, which is, what about the human element of Lynch's pride? Coming back to say, I don't ever see the dude cutting Jimmy. I do think that has to be considered because, it does look bad upon John Lynch when he does come around and release him. Regardless of the spin they put on it, there will be a segment of the fan base that acknowledges, hey, you could have gotten something for Jimmy at some point. You failed to act then. Now you're cutting him and getting zero in return. I guess I agree with the idea that it may be the right move to do it, but it does make you wonder if Lynch and his pride will allow him to.
No, I think that's a great point. I was laughing because Clean Money had a comment that Craig said Murphy's Mr. Moneybags. I thought that was kind of funny. Yeah, like I think that's a great point. Like at the end of the day, it really comes down to what is the 49ers' ultimate goal here? Like, is their ultimate goal to net some kind of compensation, or is it to win like a PR war on top of that, where they look, good in the public eye and they get the victory in the court of public opinion, or is it making the best scenario possible? Because to me, the best case scenario possible is investing into the future of your franchise. And when you moved you invested 3 first-round picks, you had the swap, the 2 trades, the 3rd-round pick to get Trey Lance, you made it very clear that Trey Lance was going to be the cornerstone of your franchise moving forward. To me, that supersedes everything. And it comes back to where I think there's some teams where they make moves that may not seem great in the court of public opinion or off first glance, but they end up the process plays out and they believe in the process. There's times, my biggest worry with the 49ers is that I think there's times where they clearly have results. They've been a very good team the last few seasons. There's plenty of teams who would love to be in their position, but it feels like whether it's draft picks, free agents, roster moves, any of this stuff, it feels like sometimes they don't have conviction in the plans that they lay out, and they don't have conviction. And like, hey, if you get a draft pick wrong, I'm not saying you stubbornly keep throwing the guy out there till the rookie contract's done. Like, yeah, sometimes you miss. Everybody does. Right. But you have to at least let them get out there to find out first. And I hate to put it like this either. If you miss that bad on Trey Lance and you're scared to let go of Jimmy because you're worried Trey Lance is going to be that bad, guess what? Your time here is limited anyway, because you don't you don't deserve to stick around if you whiffed that bad on a pick that big. And I hate to put it that way. I'm not one to call for people's jobs, but that's just the reality of the business. If you move mountains to get a guy like that, they better at least be an NFL starting player. Hey, maybe he's not going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. That's understandable. But if you can't even get the guy on the field, that's an indictment of you and your evaluation process. So ultimately, I'd like to see a little bit more conviction in their belief, because they've been pretty good, as much as people think they haven't been. Like, they've been pretty good with their draft picks. Sure, they've missed on some guys in early rounds. There's been some stuff that hasn't worked out, but it's not like they've missed on every single pick they've had. And at a certain point, have some belief in yourself and have some belief in the investment you made into this young man to be your quarterback. And my last thing that I'm trying to say with this is if Murphy is what he's saying, if it's like, hey, we're worried to move on from Jimmy because we don't know what we have in Trey yet. He's been in the building for a year. You know what you have at this point. He's going up against the first team defense in practice. Sure, it's not game reps, but you have to have some idea. And again, if it's that bad where you have to keep Jimmy around, Jimmy Garoppolo is not saving your job, dude. If you have to keep Jimmy Garoppolo around and not play Trey Lance for a couple more years, like, you might as well start packing bags and filing out, start updating that LinkedIn profile, because it's your days aren't going to be very long
updating the LinkedIn profile. I love it. Well, Murphy comes back in. If they are trying to keep their future open, why trade 3 firsts for Trey? If they didn't and bolstered the lineup, they could have won a Super Bowl last year and or had picks to trade for a proven quarterback this year. I agree with the sentiment that if the 49ers had pursued a different strategy and allocated their first-round draft pick to someone that could have helped the team last year, it may have been enough to push them over the top. They decided to hedge their bet and move on from Jimmy Garoppolo in this sort of weird, slow dynamic, or maybe not move on from Jimmy Garoppolo, but get his backup nonetheless. To me, it is still a worthwhile trade, because I look at it from the perspective, well, what if we hadn't? What if Trey Lance had never come out last year and he had stuck around and gone back to North Dakota and had another undefeated season? He may have been the number 1 consensus overall draft pick in this year's draft. And then the deal that we gave up to get him wouldn't seem like a stretch. So to me, it's still just preaching patience. I believed in Trey Lance before the 49ers selected him. I still believe it. I get that this Jimmy Garoppolo kerfluffle that has unfolded has left us all unsure how it's going to play out. but I still believe wholeheartedly that Trey Lance is the future for this team.
Yeah, and he has to be. I don't think again, I don't want to sit here and be like, oh, it didn't work out. They're keeping Jimmy, and he's up. But I'm just saying, if that's what happened, I'd be like, something had to have happened along the way with his development, because from everything I saw and I watched, he looked like a guy that he needed a little bit of fine tuning, but all the tools were there. And this is where I come back to, I don't think it's going to be that bad. I think they're making the optics much more difficult than they need to be by hanging on to Jimmy. But I think ultimately, Trey Lance is still going to be the guy in 2022. Right now, all these people that are, freaking out that Jimmy's going to start week 1, if I would be very interested to see what the betting odds are on that, because if I was a betting man, I would still be pretty confident it's going to be Trey Lance. And nothing I've seen is made waver from that. But I do agree, Murphy makes a good point. Hey, if you're this desperate to keep the guy around, you're this desperate not to let him loose, it leads people to speculate, is this more about the other guy than Jimmy Garoppolo? Is this about the pick that you don't feel is ready? And whether that's true or not, you invite that speculation and that discussion by your own actions, or in this case, inaction, by keeping him on the roster.
That's the most compelling point to me. Jerome M., one of our sneakerheads here on the channel, coming in. When John and Kyle were hired, they told Jed the cupboard was bare. They stated that realistically, this was going to be a 5-year build. Jed said, okay. They exceeded expectations after only 2 years with a Super Bowl appearance in year 3. I think Jerome is given a vote of confidence for the front office. And I'm hearing, a similar train of thought from you, in that, hey, this is a front office that has earned some respect, that has earned some trust from us. And I think in that trust, in that respect, we have to allow this to play out and see, do the 49ers go into camp with Jimmy on the roster? Do they get something in return for him? At right now, it's just a little early to be making some of these sweeping judgments.
Yeah, and I'm with you, Jerome. I have, it's a tough fight when people are, in the, I don't want to say coming from a place of emotion, because there's a lot of logic that goes into this, and 49ers fans are very smart and very up to date. And I don't want it to just be like, oh, they're coming from a place of emotion, but there is a lot of emotional based anger towards the situation that I think clouds the fact that there have been objectively successful seasons. Yes, winning the Super Bowl is the ultimate goal. I totally understand that. And it's much easier to be like, hey, well, if they'd won the Super Bowl with Jimmy, I'm sure a lot of people that are upset with the situation would give them more of a leash or more leeway with the situation. But given where they started and where they are now, it's really hard not to give them equity. So I am with you, Jerome. I fight that fight all the time in Twitter Spaces and on my own. If anybody follows me on Twitter, you see I get called, all kinds of names, and people act like I'm, sucking up to the organization. I'm like, dude, the 49ers don't give me a check. I'm just looking at this as, I know what it was like before they got here, and I know what it's like now. And they objectively have a pretty good track record. So I agree with Jerome. I'm willing to let this play out. But I also think that the speculation isn't completely unfair and the speculation isn't unwarranted, because they've allowed that to brew over the last year or so. So sure, I'm with Jerome. Let the situation play out. But if you feel a certain type of way about this, or you're concerned, you have every right to, because that possibility still exists. And as long as Jimmy is on the roster, those questions are always going to be there, and they will always be fair questions as well.
Yes, the 49ers bear the responsibility of creating the environment that allows for those questions to be valid questions at this point. We got a few more super chats here. William Bennett coming in, sneakerhead on the channel. Like I said, if Jimmy's on this team in OTAs, John Lynch should be fired, and all the draft capital and draft money for Jimmy is crazy. William, I understand the emotion attached to that. I'm not willing to speculate that far. I've got to see how everything plays out. If at some point the 49ers move Jimmy for some type of reasonable compensation, I will be very pleased about that, even if I have to go through weeks of speculation in order to get there. It'll be torturous, but it could be worth it. Sired coming in. I'll be honest, this overplaying the Jimmy hand is hitting me harder than I'd have figured. Me too. I actually am emotionally a bit exhausted by the back and forth. That's the interesting part to me, is just wondering when it will all end. It seemed like we had a date in mind of when this thing was going to end, and then that date came and went. All right, last one here. Murphy coming back in. I don't get the impression the team really wanted Trey last year, or was even torn on it. If you keep him, half the fan base and maybe Trey would be pissed, but I think the locker room would love it. I'm not so sure. I feel like the locker room would be torn much like the fan base because of that human element. I think they said goodbye to Jimmy Garoppolo. I mean, Juice came out before one of the games last year at the end of the season and said as much and said that, it was that sort of heartfelt moment. I think it is awkward to unpack all those emotions, recommit yourself to Jimmy Garoppolo when most of these players, I think, probably went into the offseason beginning to commit themselves to Trey Lance as the future.
Yeah, and I agree. And I don't think Murphy's wrong in the sense that there's a lot of guys who have liked Jimmy Garoppolo being their quarterback. I've heard directly from players who back up everything they say about Jimmy Garoppolo, and they feel what they say in the press and what they're telling, that's not just fluff to make a teammate look better. Like, there is a genuine amount of admiration for Jimmy Garoppolo, but it also is a situation where these guys know they know what comes with him being on the roster, I feel like. And again, I'm not saying that they're going to outright protest and the locker room is going to be terrible. When we say locker room harmony, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to dislike Jimmy or not want him back, but it's going to create unneeded division from the outside. Like, hey, there's going to be organic division that exists within any sports team and any professional sport where you have 55, 60 guys in the same locker room constantly. You're going to have things you bicker and squabble about, but this is something where it's outside noise is going to drive the conversation. And they did a pretty good job blocking it out for this season. It just feels like something where if you're banking on that to happen again, you're asking more from these guys than I think what they signed up for. And again, I'm not one of these people that sits here and goes, oh, they get paid millions of dollars, they can deal with the questions. No, I'm sorry. That's not part of it. They get paid millions of dollars to go on the football field and execute. They don't get paid millions of dollars to be asked the same question 15 times a week. And I can empathize as somebody who has to ask those questions a lot of times. I'm sick of it, dude. Asking the questions, I'm sick of it. I can imagine they're getting sick of it too. So it just makes more sense to clean slate, move forward. You made a decision, live by it. Let's go see what Trey Lance has. And hey, if it doesn't work out, like, that's a problem for all of us to deal with in 2023 or 2024. But in 2022, we shouldn't have to be sitting here worrying about it. The fan base should be excited about this young, intelligent quarterback that has a great arm and is mobile and has all this charisma and all these things. Like, that to me is what they're ultimately taking away too. This is the time where you can really build up this camaraderie with Trey Lance in the franchise and get people really excited and buying in. And hey, we were this close. Now we got this crazy gifted quarterback. Instead, the conversation is, well, why are you hanging on to the guy that you traded all these picks to replace? So again, I'm just throwing that. This is free game for whoever's, out there, in the sports world for your PR teams. Like, I'm happy to help out. I just feel like this is something that should be common knowledge, like, you're much better off selling your fan base on the physically talented 22-year-old quarterback than, oh, please believe in us. We have this 30-some-odd-year-old quarterback that we traded to move off of, but we're not ready to get rid of him yet. Right. So it creates such an unneeded narrative, man. It does. All right, we're wrapping this thing up. Dr. Robert Anthony Jr., sneakerhead here on the channel, doing the good deed, asking you to like the content here. If you haven't liked the video, I would ask, why not? It's fantastic. Jordan's been crushing it. We've been having a good vibe here. We got one topic I want to end with you, Jordan. I want to ask you one question on your way out there. But for those of you still watching, go follow Jordan. All of the information is down below in the description of the video. You can find his new Twitter handle. You can find Niners Nation, where you can go read his delightful content. It is fantastic. But Jordan, I want to get your opinion on one last thing, and you can keep it, somewhat succinct here for yourself, because I know you got a big show coming up with Brad Graham at 6:30, 16 minutes. So we got to get him out of here. But what do you believe are the best remaining fits at free agent that might address some of the holes for the San Francisco 49ers? Are there 2 or 3 guys that you have your eyes set on that are realistic targets for the 49ers to still pursue at this point? Yeah, real quick, I think they should try and bring back Arden Key if they can. I know he was with Detroit earlier today having a meeting. I'm sure he'll have some interest. I just thought that the versatility he brought and the ability to rush from the interior was extremely valuable. And if they can get him back at a good price, I'd really like to see that. Derek Barnett, who was with the Eagles for the last 5 years, another guy, he's been really good against the run. He's kind of been inconsistent as a pass rusher, but he has a lot of physical tools. And to me, he screams like the ideal, get this guy with Chris Kosaric for a year, allow him to get on this line. You get him for a team-friendly deal. You let him rebuild his value. And then, hey, if you work to re-sign him next year, great. If somebody else pays him, great. But you get that 1 year where it's a mutual benefit for the 49ers getting the production from the player. And then the player gets a chance to rebuild their value and really cash in on a big multi-year deal next year. I don't know what his his market is now. Maybe he's getting comfortable deals in the $9 to $10 million range, $8 million range, where he feels like he can take a 3-year deal now. But if that market dries up for him, he's a guy I'd really like. A lesser known name, I really like Ronnie Harrison from Cleveland. He's a safety. He was with Jacksonville, came out of Alabama a few years ago. I don't think there's a lot of things I think Tart does that he doesn't, but if they don't bring back Jaquiski Tart, I think Ronnie Harrison is the same kind of build. He's 6'3", 215, solid build, could fill his run gaps, get down in the box and bang near the line of scrimmage. He's a guy that I would like to see them bring in. That's not necessarily a household name or a heralded name, but I think would be a really good fit.
That's great. I love those first two, and the third gives me something to look up. I always enjoy your insights, Jordan. Well, we've got Castro 007 saying he wants to see the Niners versus the Raiders in the Super Bowl. I'm good with that because that means my Niners are in the Super Bowl, so bring that on. That would be fantastic. And then we have our latest sneakerhead join the channel. James Williams is the latest sneakerhead. It has been a fantastic show. We got to get you out of here. Thank you so much for being on. As always, we will most definitely make this happen again. Jordan, it has been a pleasure speaking with you, my friend.
It's always good seeing you, and thank you to everybody in the comments for all your stuff. There's a lot of great stuff that I, didn't have the time to address, but I see you guys there, and you guys make this more fun for me, and I always appreciate you guys supporting Rob. Rob's awesome. I don't need to tell you guys that, so thank you for everything.
Appreciate it. I will get going. I will be back on with the 49ers mailbag live tomorrow at 5 p.m. Jordan is going live at 6:30, so we're getting him out of here. You know the drill. Until then, cheers, 49er faithful.